And good evening and welcome back, and welcome to some of you that have just joined us. I'm very excited. Thank you so much for sharing with us the introduction to the annual general meeting, Sarah and Angela, and for a very beautiful presentation by Rolando. So I think some of you have stayed with us from the first hour and moving into this, but just maybe just to recap for those of you just joining us, it's the second annual general meeting, and as a foundation, I think really important just to share with the community and make visible, or make a moment to look back and reflect. And I think maybe for today, for our round table today, we're not just taking a moment and looking back at the last year. In actual fact, we're taking a moment and looking back at the last 10 years. So those of you that have just followed us from our social media and some of the conversation, we very, very unfortunately will not be having some of the roundtable members with us, but we have some others joining us. So I'd like to welcome Sarah Cheang, who will be with us as one of the key sort of members of the RCDF as we reflect on the last 10 years. Follow that also with Toby Slade, who is joining us very early in the morning. So thank you very much. Sandra Niessen, it is also, as with, I think it was Daniela in the previous session, it's 3 o'clock in the morning where Sandra Niessen is. So we have said to her, she's welcome to join us, but we also understand that 3 o'clock is a really difficult time. And Leslie, who was going to be joining us, is unfortunately on a plane as we speak. So doing a Zoom from a plane, I don't think is going to be possible. But we have invited 3 other members from and very much so from the fantastic Global Fashion Assembly that we had in October last year. So we're joined by Chepkemboy, and Chepkemboy is joining us from Kenya, so thank you so much. We're joined by B. Arthur, and I can never keep up with B, but I think today she's in Ghana. But she's a real little, she does get around. And then we're joined also by Mandish, who is now based in London. And so thank you so much for joining us. And really, I think we've just got a sweep through 10 years, and maybe just really to start that sort of 10-year story, I think maybe Sarah, and then maybe followed by Toby, just a reflection like, you know, yes, where you met, but maybe kind of also thinking about like what was that principle, or that sort of conceptual sort of underpinning of what you found at the beginning of the journey that's made you stay with the journey for 10 years.
Fantastic question. So we're talking about 2012, aren't we? The autumn of 2012, and I met Angela at a different conference. It was a conference about fashion cities. I think it was World Fashion Cities. And I'd been working for a long time on questions around fashion and ethnicity and race, and particularly about histories of fashion in China. So I knew that there was a lot wrong with how I fitted into conference structures and fashion conferences, and the kinds of books I was reading, and the assumptions that were being made about what fashion is and what fashion does if you're working away from Western frameworks, and looking at particular histories or particular identities or from particular viewpoints. And there was a lot I wanted to say, and I couldn't really find the place and the people to say it until I met Angela, who was talking about the same things. And not only that, had actually organised a conference to bring people together to talk about the same things, which was something that I wanted to do, but had never got around to, but Angela's the person that gets around to it and actually does it and makes it happen. So I went to Angela's conference, which was in Morocco, in Rabat, where I also met Toby there and many others. So that was the start of it. So that was the start. And to cut a long story short, I think the reason why I've then stayed is because I felt I'd met a group of people who were looking to actually do something about the issue. So, and it wasn't just about, well, I'm going to, go away and write a paper that criticizes the way that fashion as a term is defined. We're actually saying, okay, so what can we do differently? How can we find more people like us? How can we create the sea change that we want to see, initially very much in fashion studies, but also thinking more broadly about what fashion is and what fashion does, and how many people who engage with fashion in so many places, whether you're designing, whether you're consuming, whether you're in fashion mediation, that if you care and if you have particular if you are aware of that your position is not accounted for in the standard narratives of what fashion is and what fashion does, then can we get together with you? Can we do something? Can we make change? And we can maybe talk in a bit about what those changes have been. But for me, the reason I've stayed was that feeling of finding the people who I could do something with about the problems that I felt I was facing as a lone scholar.
Yeah, that was my experience too. I really felt that for a long time in my early career, I'd just sort of been alone and going to lots of conferences, but not quite fitting in there. I was studying Japanese fashion, and I discovered quite early on this sort of overarching feeling from Western theory that sort of, we've discovered the future for you. And it's sort of like, well, here's the future, you can now catch up. And this was certainly the prevailing attitude in art history, and it had sort of seeped into what I was doing in constructing a fashion history too. And so I was going to all these conferences and trying to explain this. I didn't quite have the words yet, but I didn't belong anywhere. And then I got invited to Angela's conference in Morocco, and it was sort of like, we didn't have answers at all, but we sort of shared a problem, or a feeling that there was a problem in all the writing that existed up to that point about fashion. And in our various parts of the world, we sort of then thought, well, we better get on and start correcting that. And I think I stayed because Angela and it was the non-Western fashion conference at first, and then it became the Research Collective for Decoloniality and Fashion. But they kept challenging me. I was exactly what Sarah said, in that I was the one that wanted to just go home and write a paper about it, and then get on with my comfortable, life. And that was always the structure I had of how to be an academic. Is you ask some difficult questions, and then you get paid, and and life goes on. But it kept being a challenge. And that first big challenge I remember of switching from, we're just going to be a research group that thinks about the non-West, to actually engaging with this very difficult and fraught and as yet sort of undeveloped body of theory around decoloniality. I was petrified, because it was unknown territory, and it was it's not what you're supposed to do in academia. You're supposed to develop your little niche and get super comfortable and just publish. And so I stayed because it was always this challenge, and this and Angela always, she always just shocks me, like, okay, we're not going to do papers anymore, or we're not going to do conferences anymore. We go like, oh, it's just, who am I now? So yeah, I stayed because it kept being intellectually challenging, and not just, I guess, as a scholar, but as a person. It was something that was seriously wrong about the way the history of the world had been written, that we were sort of setting out to try and to reposition or correct in a little way.
Thank you so much, Toby. I think that's just really, really incredible. And I'm going to take a moment just to reflect briefly on when I first, because I think I joined the collective in 2017. So this was, you had already been navigating some of these spaces for about 5 years. So there was definitely, from my position in South Africa, I kept seeing the non-Western fashion conference, and I think I studied those programs, and I used all the abstracts and the titles of the papers for in my classes as exercises in thinking about what happens if we think about fashion differently, what happens if we think about writing or thinking about fashion differently. So I was incredibly sort of dedicated follower of what was on paper. But then I think when I met in person, and I met Angela at a conference in Brighton, and then that just sort of quite organically, and I think I just wanted to touch on that sense of coming to a place like a family or a home or a family or a community. So the sense of community, finding a space in which, as a lone kind of academic from Africa, I think I sort of was also struggling to find where did I fit in. I was doing fashion studies, but I was coming from a very different position. So it was a really important place. And I think maybe what I wanted to take this opportunity to sort of say, I came in 2017, and I came in at that crux moment where I think, and Angela, I'd like to maybe draw you in here, because that was really the decision to change a number of things from, just doing an annual academic conference, because that only invites a certain kind of speaker, writer, academic, and a certain kind of knowledge gets perpetuated, and a certain kind of erasure gets perpetuated. So what that transition was that we then navigated. So really kind of, I think after the first 5 years, you kind of came to a point, and I landed in that, and there were some radical decisions that moved from the conference to Maastricht and a name change. So I don't know if you want to navigate that.
Thank you, Erica. I mean, I will address it, but if you would allow me, I would like to share also kind of like go back to the beginning a little bit. But what I also wanted to say is thank you, Toby. I think it's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly brave what you just said and what you just shared. And I recognize it now that you're saying it, so thank you for that. But what I also wanted to kind of like share is, first of all, when I started, whatever, 2012, decoloniality was not fashionable. It was a completely different world back then. So maybe it makes sense now, but back in the days, we were not, whatever, welcomed with open arms. We were this very weird, whatever, bunch of people doing tree hugging or whatever. That is one thing. But what I also wanted to say when I think about it is I considered myself a nobody. I was just like doing my little PhD in Morocco. I had left, I think, 5 years when I reached out to organize this conference. But so why I want to share this is whoever is listening to these recordings, when you have an idea and you believe in your idea, please go ahead and do it, because before you know it, I reached out to all the people that I have been reading. I mean, Toby, I've been reading your work, Sarah, I've been reading your work, and Leslie and, Jennifer and all those people. I mean, for me, they were Sandra Niessen, for sure. Those were the people I was reading. Those were the people that were, my elders intellectually. And when I reached out to all these people, they all said yes. Not only did they come to this weird conference in Rabat, Morocco, but they also, again, yeah, joined the steering committee, you know, and stayed, you know. 10 years later, most of you are still here. So just to share with the people out there that, you know, you consider yourself a nobody, as in academically, right? Again, I just freshly, I think, finished my PhD 2 years earlier, and then reached out to all these people. So, because a lot of people also, or students, reach out to me, yeah, but what can we do? Well, you can, you know, it's what Catherine Walsh calls the cracks. You know, you can have flowers, you know, grow in the cracks of the system. So just like Erica and Sarah and Toby was saying, I didn't fit in. I didn't feel at home, either in the conferences I was presenting, but even in the departments, even in the department where I did my PhD, I didn't feel at home. So it's not a matter of that you don't fit in, it's the system that doesn't fit you. And there's people out there that also don't fit. So just reach out, look for those people, and, you know, just go for it. That's one thing I wanted to say. And then the transition. So, you know, we did what we knew back then, as in doing an academic conference, right? That's what we were programmed to do. That's how we were formatted to think. And again, you know, write those papers and try to be comfortable, but none of us were comfortable. And then I don't believe in coincidences, but what changed my life was coming across that article by Rolando Vazquez and Walter Mignolo, who now many years later are actually, you know, on our advisory board. So that's how the world works. You know, people meet each other. But anyway, so I read that article on decolonial aesthesis, and somehow words were put on my feelings. Words were, you know, making things clear what all these years for us didn't make sense, or it wasn't right, or it didn't feel right. And yeah, that definitely made us thinking, because it also showed that an academic conference was not the way forward, was not the way we were going to address these issues or start, you know, working on these issues. And so from, I think, what is it, 4 or 5 conferences? I'm not quite sure how many there were. Yeah, we really, I mean, and it wasn't easy, let's be honest. Yeah, Sarah.
Could I just jump in here? And I think also we had these really utopian ideas about how we were going to hold these conferences. So we were going to, you know, it was very open. We'd have these open calls. We really wanted to host conferences in the places where people, almost where academics were often afraid to travel to, and people would ask questions about, is it safe to come, you know, people would almost be amazed there were universities in countries that aren't on the normal conference circuit, let alone the idea that you could travel there and have an intellectual exchange. So we had all these very utopian ideas, but putting it into practice was more difficult, because we were in the, you know, we at the end of the day, it comes down to funding and money. You can't hold a large conference without some money behind you. So then we were having to find the institutions that had money, and ultimately they have the institutions that have money and power. They then apply certain things they have to see as part of the conference. We had, you know, many amazing planned conferences that then disappeared because you know, things couldn't happen quickly enough for that particular location. It needed to be now or never, and the timeline for an academic conference is too long, or the money moves away. So, you know, I feel that there are a number of ways in which we saw really, and not to mention the peer review of papers and what that does to people and their proposals, and not to mention the lack of funds to enable people to travel. So there's so much here, but at the end of the day, I think we tried so hard to try and get those conferences to be the thing that we felt would be more inclusive, would start to help us answer some of these problems, would bring people into the room to talk with us that we knew we needed to talk to, and have them talk to us. And then actually the whole point is be with people in a room, and we can get everybody wanted in the room because of the financial situation and the politics of the geographies and the systems. So yeah, I think we were very, very idealistic, thinking that we could run these conferences and achieve our aims. So yeah, they had to go. Back to you, Angela. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but I also think, yes, but on the other hand, we also did 5 conferences without any funding. So not sure how we got away with it, but we did. So anyway, just to say that if you believe in it, if you think you can do it, or if it needs to be done, you think that it needs to be done, then you can make it happen. So for me personally, to step away from the academic conferences was really when I started to learn about, you know, decoloniality and what actually an academic conference represents, and that was not the way forward, again, of addressing the issues, but also having the right people to address the issues. So that takes us to the Jan van Eyck, right, in Maastricht. So that was our first kind of like alternative to an academic conference, but also, so we wanted a day of conversations. Basically, we invited a whole bunch of people to join us on that day, a whole day to talk about. And the thing is, remember, Erica, when we decided to take out the names, so in an academic conference, you have these so-called keynote speakers, you know, and they have like an elevated status to the other participants, right? Because they're the keynotes. And we decided like, but that doesn't fit. You know, we want to have an equal conversation with everybody on the same level. And then all these people didn't show up because their names were taken off from the program. And so, you know, those were the little things that we really started to learn how the system works, right? Probably also these keynotes, if their name is not on the program, they probably don't get funding, or they can't put it whatever on their little record, you know, of things that they did that year or whatever, didn't get the credits from the department or God knows what. So that was already little things that you start realizing how we're all stuck in this system of validation, you know, as an academe, as a, you know, who gets to whatever, what reputation. The same with like titles, you know, when we started to get rid of titles like associate professor, professor this, and head of department that, and because that's all a way of creating, you know, a hierarchy that we wanted to get rid of. But it's not as simple to get rid of those things because people depend on it to validate their credibility, I suppose, as an academic. So yeah, so that was sorry, Maastricht. So that was still a physical space, and I believe it was the last physical space where we met. So even pre-corona, we were just like, you know, so many people couldn't join either because they didn't have the finances, but many also because they couldn't get a visa. They literally would not be allowed in the country. So yeah, we decided from then onwards to do things online, to take things online.
But I think maybe just to sort of sit with that Maastricht moment was also when I think Toby kind of pointed to this what did it mean to move from the non-Western fashion, and what were we navigating by and the challenges of that name change as a kind of pointing to understanding the power that we were kind of investing in a collective, and not trying to reproduce the violence of maintaining it as the non-Western. So what did that, so that was really for me the kind of crux, because at that Maastricht event, it was a 2-day it was a 10-day residency, but it was a 2-day event that we had 1 day of conversations, and then it was a climate emergency event, and it was the first time that actually climate change, fashion, and decoloniality were 3 key concepts that were brought into this dialogue together, and that was 5 years ago. So, and the kind of difficulty, even amongst ourselves, to kind of sort of think, is it possible to bring these sort of big concepts together and to work with them? So the decision to become the research collective for decoloniality and fashion. And I wonder if you want to just reflect that, Angela, and maybe, and then, yeah.
Yeah, so again, you know, that word decoloniality back then, I think is very different from now, as in it wasn't so welcoming as it is now. And even within our group, you know, we were hesitant, I think. I kind of, like, you know, stubborn as I am, pushed kind of, like, you know, through that. I kept on insisting on it. But yeah, at the time, I think it took us a year, let's put it that way. It took us a year to move away from an academic conference, to move away from our old name, you know, that idea of the Non-Western Fashion Conference, but also to move away from how we were thinking and operating. I mean, for me personally also, I started questioning my role as an anthropologist, you know, my training in the Netherlands, the coloniality of my training, of my discipline. So yeah, and that idea of what does it mean to just, you know, I was building literally a career on doing research in Morocco. So I was, you know, being part of an othering of a whole community that weren't self-representing, that weren't talking, you know, for themselves. I wasn't collaborating, I wasn't co-writing, you know. So I was like everybody else in that system of trying to build an academic career for myself based on writing papers, publishing books, on studying the other, you know, because that's what anthropologists do. So for me, it flipped everything upside down. For me personally, professionally, as an anthropologist, and then, yeah, which formats to look for to create knowledge differently. But maybe here's also where I would like to invite Chepkenboy, because Chepkenboy, if you remember the first time you participated, or I think that you were involved in the collective, is when you participated in Tokyo. So that was actually our last Non-Western Fashion Conference, where we invited you, as at the time, I believe you considered yourself, let's say, more of an influencer or social media or journalist than necessarily an academic, but correct me if I'm wrong. And how did you feel welcomed, or maybe even unwelcomed, in that academic field?
For a long time, when I started this work, it was more of a personal thing, because I was curious, as a person who loves fashion, who is African, what is fashion for me, and does it include my ancestry? So that's where I sort of started from, the practical side. And then I was always online looking for other decolonizing fashion spaces, and I came across the RCDF page, and the RCDF page followed me. And then I got to find out about the paper, about the writing about for Tokyo's conference, and I signed up for that. And then I found myself in Tokyo with all these different and interesting academics who are doing similar work to mine. And it is for me, it was such a big discovery to see that this could be thought of in a different way, because for me, it was more of a personal concept, but now also seeing it in an academic perspective, and from the academic perspective, how it creates change amongst people. So it also helped me think differently about my work, how to make it practical, but also useful to everybody. So it was quite mind-changing for me, mind-opening actually, to be in this space. And then everyone, I felt part of it as well. As much as I did not have any doctorate or any master's degree, I just had my one degree, but I always felt welcomed, and I always felt heard, which was a very new thing for me, because I didn't know so much outside of what I was doing in the decolonizing space, because I tried to reach out to different magazines and to different designers and artists, but all of them were tackling decolonizing on the African, decolonizing in Africa more as a trend that they would do it for a brief time. So coming to this conference, and I got to see that this is actually deep and very intense, ongoing work. I feel like it really changed me in different ways and helped me look at my work in a completely different way.
Yeah, I mean, Chepkenboy, one of the things I remember about meeting you for the first time in Tokyo was that that was actually it was a workshop that stroke seminar that we were holding, and actually I'm remembering now, and it was great because it was small and intimate, but it had a really wide range of people. And I'm remembering that was a kind of transitional phase that we were trying. Again, it's all about the doing and the attempting and the trying things out. When we moved away from trying to organise huge conferences and we went into stealth mode. Do you remember? And we said, let's infiltrate other people's conferences and hold smaller sessions within other conferences. So we did a double session within the Costume Society of America conference. So we started to sort of stealthily try and infiltrate other places rather than holding a big conference. And this was more of the workshop where we met you, Chepkenboy, was a collaboration with another seminar series, which is held at Bunka University in Tokyo. Which had a real emphasis on the transnational, thinking about fashion and the transnational. So we were able to offer a dialogue between the transnational seminar series and the research collective for decoloniality in fashion, and actually kind of almost take over that space, which was a really, it was a great opportunity and privilege, and it shifted everything that we had, all of our conversations in Tokyo rather than in Maastricht or in London. Yeah,
and I think it's pointing to something that very much kind of came through from the first session with the chairs, this idea that the RCDF, it's not just something that's on paper and as a critique of the system, but it's actually the doing. So I think welcoming somebody like Chepkenboy, who's very much a practitioner, and so speaking from a place of experience into a place of theory, as opposed to the other way around. So I think there was a real welcoming of that kind of voice. And maybe, I remember, Toby, I think your reflections at the end of that conference also kind of spoke to kind of the positionality of kind of knowing something because you've experienced it, and then being able to speak from quite a different place. So Toby, I don't know if you want to just reflect on that.
Certainly, but I also sort of wanted to reflect on some of the pushback around the whole concept of moving from a non-Western conference to a conference that was addressing, or a group that was addressing decoloniality, was also I guess, and talking about this Tokyo conference is important here because Japan never thought of itself as having a colonial history or being colonized. And so it was, being a historian that was looking at Japan made that sort of quite a difficult leap to apply decolonial thinking onto a whole history that sort of had resisted coloniality by thinking it was never part of it, or indeed doing it itself in the sort of Japanese colonial projects in East Asia. So I guess the intellectual leap that I had to make too was that coloniality was built into all systems. It wasn't just the formal establishment of trading or government systems within another territory. It was a whole system of knowledge that had been sort of plonked on the rest of the world. And that was for me a really difficult thing to sort of put in, because there was a lot of resistance from other historians of Japan, because it was, oh, Japan wasn't colonized. There was that, there was the occupation after the war, but it wasn't really the same as formal colonization. So that was always and I guess it is still an ongoing problem in my work, is that how do you then, is this a replication of a sort of a one size fits all way of producing knowledge on a world that is always filled with radical difference? And that continues to be, something I grapple with.
But I think also just the idea that and you bring up this term systems, and I think we're dealing with a fashion system which has a really, 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 really broad-reaching sweep, sort of in terms of sort of global spread and infiltration. We're speaking about knowledge systems as well, so the sort of academic practices that then support particular kinds of voices or particular forms of argument, particular forms of doing and critique. So these systems, and then how these systems, and I think just Toby, Angela shared a recording of Rolando in the first session, and I think just really interesting for all of us in the room to kind of sort of think also around how radical that kind of paradigm shift that we're asking to happen around fashion, to undo the way in which fashion has come to be understood and operates as a kind of global language. Chepkamboy, I'm just going to say, I think just in terms of Japan, and then maybe I'd like to maybe just move on with B maybe as well, to kind of sort of think about what it means to travel the world with a different fashion sensibility, and how that system, to challenge that system. So we've spoken about challenging the academic system, but this fashion system. So Chepkamboy, I think that's really core to your work, is the way in which your practice is trying to challenge a system of being in the world.
I still also face, sometimes I meet people here who ask me if I'm wearing a costume for Halloween, and it's in my own country, and such questions usually fascinate me. And then also, interestingly, when I came to Tokyo, I was actually held at the airport for a bit because they were asking me what I've come to do. They wanted proof of the letters of invitation, so I had to give them the Japanese letters. I had to declare also how much money I'd carried. It was a whole thing, being in the airport. And then I'd also noticed that the people who were held with me were also people of color, but from different nations. Yeah, so that was my first experience coming into Tokyo. But besides that, just walking around, I realized when I enter fashion spaces, there's no problem really. I don't face too much weird questions or anything, but moving around in other different spaces that are not fashion, or in art space or creative spaces, or if I'm working in a supermarket in different countries, people would ask to take photos of me, because if sometimes it felt intrusive, because I'm just going about my days dressed as what I imagine if my great-grandmothers were alive, this is how they'd be dressed. So it's always that, sometimes there's that acceptance, and sometimes there's that being sort of commodified, or being asked or being assumed to be a certain type of person. So it's always, it's just, I just have to choose to just show up there I want to show up.
That's incredible. I think it's an important thing is showing up, and maybe Angela, some of the things that have been reflected back to the RCDF is sometimes just showing up in these spaces, showing up with colleagues showing up with you know, a record of projects. So I'm gonna leap us a little bit forward, and so Tokyo was in 2019, early 2019, and then we had COVID. There's a whole lot of conversations that we continued in kind of rethinking how do we bring people together, and so really putting practice to that idea of inviting as many voices as decentered as possible. And then B did join us quite late in the program, but it was part of the Global Fashioning Assembly, and just what that meant for you, B, just as a kind of activist that you are as well, but also a global citizen. So maybe just what it was like to land in the planning and then to actually, you know, manifest as part of the Global Fashioning Assembly. So I think B, if you want to join us.
Hello, everybody. Yes, so of course I was delighted. I was very happy to be invited to be part of the Global Fashioning Assembly family. Initially, I was wondering if I was, you know, considering that I'm not from the academia, I was wondering how exactly I was going to go about it. But then it was an exciting challenge. Because probably, even though I'm not in the academia, I think one way or the other, I have been using my fashion line to tell social stories. Specifically in my case, it was more about women in Ghanaian society. So I sort of felt like in my own way, I was already sort of involved in some kind of sociological something, you know. So yeah, so it felt interesting. It was a challenge. It was something to make me think. There were a lot of changes going on in my country in terms of fashion, how people manifested, especially the fact that I mean, I know how it sounds like that. I always use my hair as an example, but it's actually a barometer for how much the society has changed, because from being considered absolutely wild and scandalous, you know, it was almost seen as an affront. Imagine in my own Ghana. So I'm not even going to tell you people's reactions to my hair when I traveled out of Ghana. You know, like Jim Boy was saying, you know, I never particularly dressed up in very ethnic kind of clothing because first of all, I didn't want it to compete with my hair. That was the statement. Secondly, because my fashion was more reflection of my heritage. So it was more like a fusion. It was some kind of sort of like Western fashion with a little touch of, you know, something African, not necessarily Ghanaian. But yes, coming back to the original question, yes, for me, it was very exciting. It has also been a wonderful learning process, most importantly, because from listening in, you know, I might not be able to contribute as much as maybe others who have spent years studying, but the big advantage to so much from you, from Angela, from Nadish, from Chitkamoy, from everybody, you know, we're benefiting from this 10 years and more that you all have invested of your lives into, you know, doing all of this research. So I find it particularly enlightening, very educative. And I'm seeing now that there are probably things that I did without realizing what I was doing. I didn't know that I was doing decoloniality. I didn't know that I was trying to, you know, as I said, I never tried to be totally Western or completely African, just for the mere fact that I feel like I have a foot on two continents, or, you know, I'm a global citizen. So I rather looked for ways of merging things, you know. In fact, to be honest, I've even done Chinese symbols on some of my Ghanaian clothing. So I've actually embroidered Chinese symbols on indigenous Ghanaian fabrics or textiles. So my story has always been, how do I bring cultures together? How do I bring people together? How, through my fashion. So for me, the whole process of, preparing, organizing, of course, it was a little bit tedious because I had to do a lot of the work. I would confess I had to do a lot of the work myself, but that's because the other members were very busy with their lives. Some of them were actually not in the country, but I had committed myself. I truly was honored and happy and excited to be part of GFA. So I put in my all, and I'm happy that in the end, my colleagues, my friends, they showed up and they contributed meaningfully. So yeah, I think I hope I've answered your question. Erica?
Oh, thank you. But I think there's two things you said, that you were part of the GFA family. And I think that just kind of points to something really, really profound that happened with the Global Fashion Assembly, is being part of a family, feeling that you were heard, but also the kind of commitment that you gave to the project. And I think these are some of the things that